We are really honored to join you all today to highlight these critical human rights abuses experienced by women in the U.S. My name is Denise Labertu of Women Lead Network and faculty at the California State University Northridge in the Criminology and Justice Studies Department. I'm joined by my Women Lead Network colleagues, Kimberly Wong, who's going to help us to understand the impact of trauma, and Abby Sims, who's going to help us on the back end in terms of technology, keeping our community safe and engaged here today. We also want to acknowledge the work of our other colleague, Leona Smith DiFaustino, who helped to pull all of this together, but was unable to attend the event today. Women Lead Network is a collective of women who work to ensure that women's needs are centered in discussions about the world's problems and that they're engaged as leaders in solutions to those problems. This includes all who identify as women, as well as femme, gender non-binary, and other birthing folks. We also want to acknowledge that we're not the first women to work towards increasing women's power and stand with other women who've come before us, who stand alongside us, and will create a future where women around the world enjoy human dignity and freedoms. Finally, we want to recognize that we've built our lives and homes on the unceded territory of Indigenous Californians and acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging, recognizing that the first people of the land are still here, and we are committed to lifting up their stories, culture, and community. Today, in addition to being joined by my colleagues, Kimberly and Abby, we'll also connect to the work of my students at the California State University Northridge in the Department of Criminology and Justice Studies, Human Rights, Crime, and Justice course, who've been engaged in deep learning and advocacy work on the issues we'll discuss today. And we'll also hear from Diana Block, representing the California Coalition of Women Prisoners, who have been leaders in raising these issues long before our time here today. We acknowledge and appreciate the leadership and advocacy of women prisoners themselves, who have worked tirelessly to ensure that we're all aware of the experiences of their sisters. We're here today to both provide a platform for these issues to be raised in UN forums and to recognize the work that they've been doing thus far. So I'm going to take a few minutes to just give us an overview of really the topics that we're going to touch on today. Although decreasing in size during the pandemic, the U.S. still has the largest carceral system in the world. According to their own data, the U.S. incarcerates more than 1.2 million people, not including those in immigration, juvenile, and pretrial detention, which would push the carceral population to significantly over 2 million. While only 10% of the prison population are women, their incarceration rates have increased 2 to 4 times faster than their male counterparts over the last 3 to 4 decades, due to the gendered effects of carceral schemes like the war on drugs, mandatory arrest policies for domestic violence, and the criminalization of sex work. Parallel to this landscape is the dwindling access to bodily autonomy for women, femme-identified, and gender non-binary folks. While the criminalization of abortion in a Post Roe society and the criminalization of gender-affirming care are two examples, access to bodily autonomy has been precarious for many American women for decades. Reproductive justice advocates have raised the red flag long before Roe became law in 1972, and have noted that while Roe, a critical tool to provide important access to reproductive care, it still had significant gaps that prevented women across a cross-section of vulnerability from accessing true reproductive freedom, most specifically poor women, women of color, trans women and other birthing people, incarcerated women, undocumented women, disabled women, and the list goes on. This is why we're raising these issues here today on a platform that looks at the implications of human rights abuses on women and strives to intervene in and rectify the devastating impacts. Recently, I was asked what was meant by the term criminalization of gender that we use in the title of this event. That's an excellent question, and I thought it might be a good place for us to start our discussion today. Criminalization is the process that society uses to determine criminality or what and who should be punished by the state, meaning the government. Criminalizing gender means that criminality or punishment is distributed along gender lines. For example, if we look at the increased criminalization of abortion at the state level since Roe versus Wade has been overturned, those who will be and are disproportionately impacted are women and other folks who can get pregnant. Another example is the impact of the so-called war on drugs. While it's been framed as a neutral policy, it has had a disproportionate impact on low-income women and women of color. It's also important to recognize that the existing focus on sex work as a crime has a disproportionate impact on women, including trans women. The phrase criminalizing gender shines a light on the usually invisible experiences of women in the criminal legal system. Criminalizing can also describe the ways in which specific punishments get connected to certain types of crimes or types of prisoners. The issues we'll be raising today fit into both of these categories. First, we'll be highlighting the human rights abuses experienced by incarcerated women and other birthing people who've been subject to sterilization procedures without their full consent. Many have gone to prison medical personnel with complaints ranging from period cramping to between period bleeding and emerged from medical having been completely sterilized without consenting to the procedure. When justifying these procedures, egregious excuses were given that it would, quote, save taxpayers money since these women would likely end up incarcerated again or on public benefits. This would be considered a way that a specific punishment might be targeted at women. Let's not forget that because the carceral system is also racialized and classed, that these women are disproportionately women of color and poor women. The US played an integral role in the development of the UN rules for the treatment of prisoners and their 2015 revisions, the Mandela Rules. And yet, as we've just noted, incarcerated women are subjected to medical procedures that were unnecessary and unconsented to. The UN's Committee Against Torture has acknowledged denying abortion care can result in, quote, physical and mental suffering so severe in pain and intensity as to amount to torture. And the same can be said of non-consensual sterilization. Additionally, the US has an obligation under the United Nations Rules for the Treatment of Women Prisoners and Non-Custodial Measures for Women Offenders, or the Bangkok Rules, to ensure that incarcerated women are treated humanely and are provided appropriate health care, which includes the same standard of care available to women on the outside. Informed consent is key to the appropriate provision of health care and is a standard of care that prisons have failed to provide many incarcerated women. The second issue that we're looking at today is what we might call criminalized survivorship for survivors of gender-based violence. Domestic violence survivors, sexual assault survivors, human trafficking survivors are often prosecuted for fighting back, or what we more appropriately call resistive violence. Their sentences tend to be much more significant than the sentences received by those who are abusive or who are traffickers. Also, these survivors may be charged and prosecuted for crimes like defending their children, taking their children when they leave an abuser, engaging in sex work to support themselves so they don't have to return to an abuser, and of course, a variety of immigration violations due to the inhumane crossover between immigration and the criminal legal system in the US. Because of the gendered nature of these types of victimization, this impacts disproportionately women, both cis and trans. International customary law lays out the reality faced by survivors of gender-based violence and recognizes that this is a global issue that is being addressed around the world. The US has regularly implemented laws that recognize and criminalize a variety of forms of gender-based violence, including the Violence Against Women Act, but continue to fail to meet their obligations in protecting women from these harms. Additionally, while the US has not ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, which explicitly requires states to protect women from gender-based violence, it is a signatory, obliging it to act in good faith towards CEDAW's ratification and to follow its guidance until that ratification is secured. If the United States met its obligation to protect all women from gender-based violence, these survivors would not need to engage in the actions that resulted in their incarceration. Additionally, the first rule under the United Nations Rules for the Treatment of Women Prisoners and Non-Custodial Measures for Women Offenders is to keep women out of prison, including eliminating pretrial detention and increasing the use of post-conviction sentencing schemes that are gender sensitive. If the US were meeting its human rights obligations, survivors of gender-based violence would never be incarcerated. We'll hear today from students at California State University Northridge's Criminology and Justice Studies Department, Human Rights, Crime, and Justice class, who've been studying these issues and will share their findings related to the US human rights obligations in addressing and preventing the topics I've just mentioned. We'll also hear from folks who are doing the heavy lifting of abolition and working to protect their sisters' human rights. Diana Block from the California Coalition of Women Prisoners will share the work of those directly impacted by these abuses and their programs to resist the ever-increasing impact of the prison industrial complex on women. While women's resistance movements have been an equitizing factor in gains made for women in the US, we also recognize that we cannot fully engage in a true discussion and advocacy for women without also understanding the impact of trauma, both interpersonally and systemically. On an interpersonal level, trauma from gender-based violence, including that violence perpetrated by the state, can impact the way that women respond to incidents of abuse and affect their self-perception. At a systemic level, living with sexism, racism, homophobia, and misogyny, and within carceral settings, can have an insidious effect on women's lived experiences and worldview, compounding their reactions to interpersonal trauma. Kimberly Wong, LCSW, an expert in trauma resilience, will help us to understand the impacts of trauma on women who experience gender-based violence, including carceral violence. Finally, we'll give you an opportunity to develop your own understanding of the problem and to engage as an accomplice in dismantling the systems that have caused these abuses during a community conversation where we can share ideas and ask questions to develop our own plan of action to address these harms. Again, we thank you for joining us and look forward to our shared learning and advocacy. Now I'd like to hand it over to Kimberly Wong to help us contextualize today's topics within women's experiences with trauma. Kimberly Wong, LCSW, DCSW, received her Master in Social Welfare from UCLA in 1993 and has over 3 decades of experience both in community social work and in private practice. She specializes in trauma with extensive experience working with survivors of sexual and domestic violence. Her expertise includes addiction, relationships, and LGBTQ affirmative psychotherapy. Ms. Wong uses a multicultural, feminist, and empowerment-based approach that fosters independence and resilience and brings a deep understanding of how layers of culture and society shape individuals. She's certified by the Trauma Resource Institute as a trauma resiliency model practitioner and facilitator, as well as the community resiliency model teacher. For several years, Ms. Wong has actively contributed to the TRI community in their Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, where she highlights an intersectional approach of diversity related to LGBTQ, ethnicity, and gender. Committed to community social work, Ms. Wong worked with the LA Commission on Assaults Against Women, now Peace Over Violence, as a volunteer, then as Director of Counseling. At AIDS Healthcare Foundation in the early 1990s, she worked with people living with HIV and AIDS as a clinical social worker and Director of Social Services. Ms. Wong has served as a clinical supervisor for multiple community organizations, including Peace Over Violence, the LA Gay and Lesbian Center, now the LA LGBT Center, and the Asian American Drug Abuse Program. As a member of the LA County Domestic Violence Council's LGBT Issues Committee, she contributed to an LGBT DV resource guide. She also contributed to medical protocols for survivors. A leader among her peers, Ms. Wong is a current board member of the Glendale Area Mental Health Professionals Association and has served as a coordinator of the Pasadena, California Society of Clinical Social Work. She has taught in the MSW program at Cal State Northridge and has trained counseling techniques utilizing art, meditation in therapy, trauma, and multicultural issues, and maintains a private practice in South Pasadena for more than 20 years now. Thank you, Kimberly, for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you. I'm very excited to be here today. I had prepared my introduction, so I actually don't need to do it now that Denise had done it for me. So today I will be talking about trauma broadly, rather than from the clinical perspective of post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm also will be speaking from a trauma-informed and resiliency-informed perspective. And I think that this is really important. So there is a perspective shift. The conventional perspective is, which fits within the carceral system, is that people are bad and they need to be punished. So that's the conventional perspective. And in addition to that idea, the question's asked, what's wrong with you? And that's conventional. Trauma-informed perspective, however, acknowledges that there's lots of things that happen and that people are suffering, and that there's a need compassion and empathy. And there's an understanding that trauma has an impact on a person's development. And that in addition to, there's an understanding that there's survival responses that are biologically based. So the focus of biology is a shift to noticing biology versus the conventional perspective of mental weakness. What's wrong with you? Conventional. And so this is important because it shifts that conventional judgment and acknowledges that everybody has a nervous system and that we often will respond from a survival perspective, and that survival perspective is protective. And so the actions and things that people do as a reaction to trauma is often protective. So the question is, with trauma informed, is what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. So taking it to the next level, resiliency informed is also acknowledging that people are resilient. And so it's looking at what is right with you and what are your strengths, in addition to acknowledging that people are suffering and things are happening in the world. Now, resiliency is often, it can be complicated because it has been used negatively in the sense that perhaps withholding of services by using the term like, oh, well, they're resilient, so they don't need services. And that's not what I'm talking about. Resiliency is looking at that embodied well-being, having compassion and empathy, acknowledging individual and collective strengths in addition to acknowledging individual and collective suffering. And there's optimism, hope, and flexibility, as well as solution focused. So I just wanted to give you a brief sense of resiliency from my perspective, from this perspective of the Trauma Resource Institute. So the impact of trauma impacts people in so many different levels. And we know that there's a common reactions that affect a person's mind, body, and spirit. It affects us on all levels, several levels, including physically, emotionally. It affects our thoughts and how we think. It affects our behaviors, relationships, and our sense of spirituality. So for example, physically, when somebody's experienced stress and trauma, it can impact their sleep, either too much or too little. People can be numb, and so you disconnect and be numb from the body. Heartbeats, heart racing. And this is what engages, I'm not really going to talk about it, but the autonomic nervous system, which is basically a part of the nervous system that responds automatically without conscious thoughts. And it also engages oftentimes in our survival responses when we are experiencing a threat, that the things that engage in our body biologically can be like increased heart rate and mobilizing of large muscle groups. So emotionally, people experience fear and anxiety, anger, rage, depression, shame, and guilt. In terms of thoughts, people can often become forgetful. And we know that when people experience trauma, that it can, trauma memories are encoded slightly differently than regular non-stressful memories. And so this is where there could be some forgetfulness or lack of memory. It also, from our thinking perspective, it affects thoughts, negative thoughts about self, distorted thoughts, nightmares, dissociation, meaning like not being in the present moment and disconnecting from yourself. In terms of how it affects us with behaviors, people isolate, anger outbursts, self-injury, addiction. And Denise mentioned earlier, the criminalization of drugs. And so like if there's addiction, sometimes people will end up in the carceral system. And also if there's anger outbursts and violence, then that can also lead to incarceration. So this also leads to stressing relationships, impacting relationships through withdrawal or anger outbursts. And then from a spiritual, the impact spiritually is that people can lose hope, or there can be changes in faith, either a loss of the faith or the gaining of faith. So again, shifting to resiliency informed, that we often do not talk about resilience and growth reactions, things that come out of it. And I do never have been a believer, like I do not believe that things happen for a reason. That's just my personal belief. I think life has lots of challenges, things happen in life. And what can also happen out of trauma is that people can grow and there's some growth reactions. And for example, people coming out of trauma can perhaps connect to strength and courage of their own, gain hope, compassion and self for others. This could lead people to advocacy. And many advocates, not all, but many advocates become advocates out of trauma. And again, that we're not speaking about that's necessarily everyone. And we are having, as Denise mentioned, someone from the California Coalition of Women Prisoners, which is an advocacy group that's really important. And then other things that can grow out of trauma are gaining new meanings. Now, in terms of a general definition, trauma, and we often think of trauma as a big T, the big traumas, is that the individual's perception of an event as life-threatening. So that's kind of like the idea of when we talk about trauma that most people think about. So war, being surviving acts of violence, natural disasters. There is a continuum of stress because life is full of stressors. And I think it's important to make this distinction that like on one end of the spectrum is like, in terms of the continuum, is positive, that our bodies respond to moderate or mild stress. So we might have some body reactions, part of our nervous system, so our heartbeat might increase, but it kind of comes and goes, and we can return back to balance pretty easily. There's tolerable, moving up, there's tolerable stress, which is we can engage in adaptive responses to something that's time limited, and our response is time limited. And we can often return to balance with support, be it our own supports, external supports. And then toxic stress, which is kind of goes along with more of what we think of as trauma, which are intense stressors and intense body responses. And if this can happen and it happens ongoing, like enduring, it can change or impact the way our brains function. And so I think that that's important to understand. So toxic stress and trauma is, there's different kinds of toxic stress and trauma. There's what we would consider shock trauma, which is things that happen too fast, too much, too fast. So this might be a one-time sexual assault, for example, or a natural disaster, something that happens too much, too fast. It's a lot coming at you and it overwhelms the system. There's developmental trauma, which could be too little for too long. And this could include things like neglect, child neglect that's ongoing. So it happens over a long period of time. It's too little. It could also be poverty. Racism. And this leads us to both like experiencing trauma individually and systemically or institutionally. There's intergenerational and historical trauma that gets passed on based on like experiences of groups. And there can be a combination of both developmental and shock trauma, which is too much and too long. And so this is where we fall into like ongoing childhood abuse, childhood sexual abuse, domestic violence. And again, it could also involve intergeneration and historical traumas. So in terms of, I mentioned big T's, there's lots of life experiences, and there's big T's, little T's, and cumulative traumas. And again, perception is the key. And perception, how a person perceives something is important, not like if something is actually a threat or life-threatening, but if there's a perception of it, then that's what can result in how it impacts a person. So I've already mentioned things like some sexual assault, domestic violence, war. Denise mentioned earlier, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, anti-immigrant perspectives. These are all can be systemic as well as individual. And so, for example, an example could be with racism is law enforcement targeting Black and brown folks and other people of color. There's also being treated differently based on race or ethnicity by medical providers, not being offered care, given care. Sexism, Denise mentioned bodily autonomy. In the carceral system, forced sterilization. There's also gender affirming procedures that people might not have access to. Now, in terms of, again, thinking about trauma and what falls in trauma, medical and dental procedures can be traumatic, because if you think about it literally, it is a trauma to the body, medical procedures, dental procedures. And then you're adding on forced sterilization, a medical procedure without consent. Something happening to a person's body without their consent is an act of violence. There is a lack of bodily autonomy. And so this compounds things. Other stressors and traumas include incarceration and sense of safety and being harmed by staff and guards and other individuals. Microaggressions, natural disasters fall in this. Not fall in incarceration. I mean, it falls in the broad view of life experiences and traumas and stressors. Also, if you think about the COVID pandemic over the last 3 years, and initially people felt threatened, their lives felt threatened. And so if a person perceived that, then that, and it was an ongoing for a long time, that has an effect on our bodies and stressors. Poverty and lack of resources and options, which can result in making choices to do things that might be considered criminal, like sex work, and then a person might end up incarcerated as a result. And when somebody's just trying to survive due to poverty. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is survival responses and understanding the survival responses coming from the part of the survival brain, and that it's biological and protective. And again, perception of something being life-threatening and safety. And the thing that's important about this is that oftentimes our survival responses create templates for of how to survive future stressors. And so, a lot of people are familiar with fight and flight, which is a survival response. And this is when the autonomic nervous system kicks in and the survival response kicks in which immobilizes your body to fight or flee. And this is when potentially someone fights back. And Denise made reference to oftentimes a survivor might fight back, and then criminalizing survivorship, as she mentioned. There's also, like, if you're a child, when somebody's experienced childhood abuse, sexual abuse, oftentimes the perpetrator or the person inflicting abuse is larger. So fight or flight is oftentimes not an available option. So freeze is a way in which someone might respond. And again, keeping in mind that these templates can be created. So if doesn't mean it will be, but it can be. Oftentimes, like if somebody's experienced abuse in childhood, maybe a freeze response will be a common response, even though they're an adult. And again, if they're experiencing a perception of something that's life-threatening or safety, they might switch to one of these automatic responses. Something that is not talked about a lot is another response, which actually can come up before fight or flight, is tend and befriend. And this is the survival response of, like, the idea of safety in numbers, caring for children, connecting with community, and for survival, right? So that's like kind of tending, and befriending. There can also be the befriending of someone who's harming, because that also can increase a person's survival. If you befriend and connect with a person, that you might increase your survival because they can harm you, and you might not have an ability to fight or flee. And again, these are often responses that come up automatically, because survival responses are often automatic. And I think that is pretty much what I wanted to talk about, but keeping in mind, like, the broad definition of trauma and what fits in trauma, and our survival responses. I think it's important to understand the biological aspect of this, and that survival responses are often automatic and unconscious, and often kind of override our thinking brains. And that the perception of whatever is stressful or traumatic is more important than whether or not something is a threat, because that will inform how a person might respond.
Okay, thank you so much, Kimberly. This context is really so critical anytime we address human rights abuses generally, but in particular as they relate to women. Because as we've sort of scanned the data, what we understand is that in terms of the overlap of trauma and incarceration, that almost more than 90% of those women who are incarcerated have experienced some form of trauma or abuse in their past. So thank you for that context. Okay, so I am really proud at this point to transition now to the work of the students at the California State University Northridge in the Criminology and Justice Studies Department. I have the privilege of teaching the field experience class that focuses on human rights and the criminal justice system, and working with the students to understand and address the impacts of criminal legal systems on the lived experiences of those whose lives it affects. Each of the students that's presenting today, but also in the class, has worked to understand both the topics we're focused on today and the potential remedies to effectively address them. The students speaking today have worked with teams of other students to research the issues, create a campaign for reaching the community with important information about these issues, and to develop an effective intervention or remedy to the harm. They're presenting part of their work to you all here today. Each team that's focused on one of these topics has identified speakers for today's event. The first set of speakers to present will be Kayla Jeffress, Dylan Kane, and Ashley Orantes, who will focus on the issue of forced sterilization. And then Nicholas Peralta, Ronita Hoff, and Daisy Rubio will center their comments around the criminalization of survivors. So I believe that Kayla Jeffress is going to be our first speaker in this area. Kayla?
Good afternoon. My name is Kayla Jeffress, and I'm a part of the Criminology and Justice Studies program at California State University, Northridge. As a part of the human rights class, I will be addressing the issue of forced sterilization among incarcerated women in California. The United States prohibited forced sterilization against women in 1927. Although it was banned in female prisons from 1997 to 2014, women were undergoing forced sterilization without their knowledge, consent, and under the guise of falsified procedures. With an estimate of over 1,000 females being sterilized within California, these women had their right to reproduce stolen from them, and many experienced a number of medical complications in addition. Although the United States has a duty to uphold the rights of female prisoners, women's rights to their bodily autonomy were violated by a lack of ability for women prisoners to have a say in their reproductive rights, a lack of proper health care for those who are incarcerated, a lack of informed consent for the procedures being done, as well as coerced consent, and falsified documents and consent forms for sterilization procedures. The United Nations recognizes that the justice system has a duty to provide appropriate health care to prisoners. This was mentioned in the UN Bangkok Rules on Women Offenders and Prisoners. These rules mention the importance of health care, specifically reproductive health care. The Bangkok Rules also require that women in prison receive the same standard of care as women who are not incarcerated. Forcing women prisoners to undergo sterilization procedures without their consent or under false pretenses is a direct violation of these rules. In addition to this, the United Nations recognizes that prisoners have a right to access their individual medical records. As stated in Rule 26 of the United States Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, also called the Nelson Mandela Rules, healthcare services in detention facilities must maintain accurate, up-to-date, and confidential individual medical files, and prisoners must have access to these files upon request. The California State Auditor found that of the 144 inmates who underwent tubal ligations from 2005 to 2013, 7 cases at one hospital were found to have purged medical records surrounding the cases. Due to the negligence of California purging medical records of the women affected, this would be a violation of Rule 34 of the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules, which states that should healthcare providers and professionals become aware of any signs of torture or other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, they shall document and report such cases to the competent medical, administrative, or judicial authority. This violation is twofold in that the forced sterilization of women prisoners should have been reported and properly documented by the physicians who had these inmates in their care. Women's and human rights to health include reproductive and sexual health. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, also known as CEDAW, recognizes that women have a right to sexual and reproductive health, which being subjected to a forced sterilization procedure violates. Prisoners are not an exception to this right. In Article 16, CEDAW states that women have the right to decide when they want to have children, how many, as well as have the information, education, and means to be able to do so. For women who have been sterilized without their consent, and for some without their knowledge, they have had these rights taken from them. The United Nations also recognizes that women of color and women with disabilities are disproportionately victimized. During the majority of the 20th century, the eugenics laws targeted people of color, poor white people, and people with disabilities. A prime example of this is North Carolina, which forcibly sterilized 7,600 people from 1929 to 1973. The majority of these people were Black women. In addition to this, many were forced to undergo these procedures because they were deemed unfit to parent because of mental disabilities, even if that was not the case. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities states that persons with disabilities have right to equality and non-discrimination in all aspects of their life, which includes their right to family planning, fertility, and bodily autonomy. The entire concept of human rights is based on the idea of informed consent. Informed consent is one of the most important aspects of human rights and healthcare. In the audit done by the California State Auditor, it was found that for 27 inmates who underwent sterilization, the physician performing the procedure or an alternate physician did not sign the inmate's consent form, which certified that the inmate appeared mentally competent, understanding, and understood the lasting effects of the procedure. United Nations organizations are calling for an end to forced, coercive, and involuntary sterilization. These practices violate a number of rules, laws, the rules and laws that the United States affirms. And the United States and California should uphold these standards as well. Women in prisons deserve access to the same basic rights of healthcare, sexual and reproductive care that women who are not incarcerated have access to. Prisoners are human beings, and there are standards of practice in healthcare that must be followed. The United States and California need to be held accountable for the allowance of forced and non-consensual sterilization practices that violated the right for thousands of women to make their own informed decisions regarding their bodies and rights to reproduce. Thank you.
Thank you, Kayla. Dylan?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dylan Kane. I am an undergraduate student here at California State University, Northridge, and I'm presenting today as another member of the human rights class here at CSUN. Today, I hope to make it clear to all of you that the United States, despite claims, obligations, and policies that have been set into place, both here and abroad, has been in extreme violation of the rights of incarcerated individuals, specifically within California prisons. Excuse me, sorry. I want to start real quick by defining a term or an idea known as eugenics. Eugenics is defined as the study of how to arrange reproduction within a human population to increase the occurrence of heritable characteristics regarded as desirable. Throughout history, supporters of this movement have believed that the use of methods such as involuntary sterilization, segregation, and social exclusion would rid society of individuals deemed by them to be unfit. Now, this term may sound familiar to you, and if so, that is because it was made commonplace under the rule of Adolf Hitler during his time in Nazi Germany. Essentially, eugenics is one individual taking the entirety of another individual's human rights into their own hands based off their own decisions. However, as many of you may or may not know, this has occurred within the United States and specifically within the state of California within the past 100 years, and in fact, within the past 10. As mentioned previously, the human rights violations that are in question today have to do with the forced sterilization of men and women, primarily women, in California prisons between the years of 1907 and 2014. In 1927, in a landmark Supreme Court case known as Buck v. Bell, forced sterilizations were deemed constitutional, and the practice, which had been occurring for 20 years, was allowed to continue. Buck v. Bell, the decision that formally legalized sterilization, has never been officially overturned. However, in a later case known as Skinner v. Oklahoma, which passed in 1942, the US Supreme Court outlawed sterilization as a punitive measure, making the practice of eugenics and specifically forced sterilization illegal. In addition to this, the eugenics laws were repealed in 1979. In 2020, a film directed by Erica Cohen titled Belly of the Beast, a team of two women, Kelly Dillon and Cynthia Chandler, discovered a pattern of illegal sterilizations nearly 40 years after they had been banned in women prisons in California. These sterilizations had been shielded by prison officials and doctors inside of the correctional system. According to the Belly of the Beast documentary team, state audits and prison records revealed that nearly 1,400 sterilizations between 1997 and 2013 occurred in California prisons. In addition to people sterilized during labor, an unknown number of cis women and trans people were also sterilized during this period of time. Take the story of Kelly Dillon, for example, who was forcibly sterilized while incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Dillon was told she needed surgery to treat an ovarian cyst. Dillon unknowingly underwent a hysterectomy in 2001 at the age of 24. She was unaware that the procedure until her lawyer and the doctors who treated her informed the mother of two that she would never be able to have children again. This unfortunate story is the same story of many women in California's dark prison sterilization history. As of this year, 51 people have been approved for reparations. Just 3 of them were sterilized during this eugenics era prior to 1979, and the rest were believed to have been sterilized after this year. We believe that the sterilizations that have taken place in California prisons violate both human rights and the law. We make this claim via the decision in Skinner v. Oklahoma, which plainly outlawed forced sterilization in the year of 1942, as well as the human rights laid out via the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, which the United States has signed on to but not ratified, which was mentioned previously. Another element of this issue that violates both human rights and the law has been the failure of the state of California to keep adequate medical records in their prisons, specifically as it pertains to individuals who believe that they were victims of forced sterilization. California Governor Gavin Newsom passed a bill, and as of January 1st of last year, this bill allows victims of forced sterilization to apply for reparations from the state. My colleague will talk further on this bill and the limits that it has, but an essential aspect of these victims being able to receive the reparations is the presentation of the state prison records that show that the sterilization did in fact take place. Unfortunately, it seems that many of these records have been lost or never existed due to medical practice. The HIPAA privacy rule, which was passed in 1996, requires appropriate safeguards to protect the privacy of patients' identifying health information. The privacy rule also gives patients rights over their health information, including the right to access and request forms. It is because of this that we are seeking true justice for the victims of California's dark prison history. My colleague will talk in detail about the ways in which we believe justice could be made possible.
Okay, thank you, Dylan. Ashley?
Hello, yes. Hi everyone. My name is Ashley Rantes. I'm here on behalf of California State University Northridge Human Rights course. I want to expand on the topic of recommendations of forced sterilization amongst incarcerated women in California, recognizing that forced sterilization amongst incarcerated women is an act of discrimination, torture, and inhumane is a step one must take to end victimization rates of this heinous crime. When addressing the factors into forced sterilization by prison facilities in California, the medical repercussions victims face, not only having the right to bear a child taken away without consent, as well as early menopause, mental health issues, and painful side effects, are considered acts of torture. Accounting for this, California has signed the Convention Against Torture Act in 1988. Forced sterilization, especially circling around a huge factor of discrimination, has been a eugenics practice dating back to Nazi Germany. This dark history has not only repeated itself in California, but throughout the United States, and found to be relevant practice in Chile, Dominican Republic, Kenya, Namibia, and South Africa. Women should be able to have full understanding and a say on medical procedures practiced on them, along with tangible medical records at their disposal. Individuals deserve the right to bear a child regardless of one's disabilities, and it should be strengthened for the person to decide of themselves if disabled. The negligence of this act has taken away one of the ideals of womanhood and has negatively affected hundreds in California. Women that meet issues of intersectionality have been found vulnerable to this abuse of higher powers in prisons and medical facilities. With this issue being brought to light, there are major critical gaps found on the topic of forced sterilization and its occurrence in California. UN agencies are now working with UN treaty bodies that have been responsible for monitoring the state's compliance with human rights treaties to ensure there are appropriate steps in correcting the issues of forced sterilization. The unfortunate factor is that most likely hundreds of more, maybe even thousands, are naive to the fact that they cannot bear a child because they had received medical treatment at a California prison. This has been a violation of basic human rights in not only California, but throughout the United States. As reparations are concerned for victims of forced sterilization amongst incarcerated women, in 2013, Gavin Newsom, Governor of California, had passed a bill in order to bring financial compensation of $15,000 to victims, and cognizant to the fact that they had been forcibly sterilized under watch of the California State Prison Medical Institutions. Going in depth on financial aspects of this bill, the program is providing $4.5 million to disperse evenly amongst all eligible victims who have applied. In addition, $2 million for administration and outreach, and $1 million to establish markers and plaques designated sites that have recognized forced sterilization. The deadline for this bill falls towards the end of December of this year. I would like to add that 310 of the applicants that have applied to the Newsom bill, only about 51 of the victims had received the minuscule amount of financial compensation offered by California. There have been many complications in addressing this application for the victims, as a myriad of medical documentations for women's medical history has been lost or seized by medical centers that have correlations with the women's prisons. Also, keeping in mind many of the victims are limited or do not have the resources to access when filing as an applicant in order to receive compensation for this vile act. As many of the victims are re-entering society and do not have access to electronic devices to file documentation. Circling back to how applications for this compensation under Newsom bill began on January 1st, 2022 through December 31st of 2023, only giving a short amount of time for victims to even become aware of their infertility and then to request and then to receive medical paperwork from state prisons, which most victims find a great struggle in retrieving. From 1909 through 1979, under eugenic law, California has been under. Thousands who lived in California had been sterilized without consent or knowledge throughout this time frame. Although the law had been repealed in 1979, reparations in California only begun in the year 2021 and were considered the third state in the US that have been known to approve the reparations program for forced sterilization victims. Yes, now moving forward, acknowledging that they are victims of this wrongful act, it doesn't quite seem just in providing victims with such a small time frame to apply and receive compensation. The compensation that California is providing is set at $15,000. It seems unjust for one to never have a personal choice to bear a child or even start a family for some, process this information, and have such a short time in gathering evidence as a victim, as this is a traumatizing event that had taken place for many. The next steps that need to be made is having consideration for victims of their discovery of forced sterilization, along with meaning reparations for the victims. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Kayla and Dylan and Ashley. Now we'll hear from Nicholas, Ronita, and Daisy on the human rights abuses related to the criminalization of gender-based violence. Nick? Nick?
Oh yeah, I was just trying and start my video, but it wasn't working.
Okay,
Can I
all
just
right.
proceed?
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. How's everyone doing? Good evening. Here representing California State University, Northridge. One important perspective. Something to say before I begin. The meat of this little talk is one important perspective I gained from which we can look at our criminal justice system and the cases it takes on is one I learned from my late professor, Nicholas Zingo, in my Intro to Criminal Justice course, my first ever criminal justice class, where he would frequently begin answers with to students' questions with, well, it depends. It depends. It always depends. With that being said, a dark undercurrent afflicts our state and nation in the form of the criminalization of the escape of victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. This being a result of what the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention consider a public health problem, taking the form of intimate partner abuse. This affects 10 million people per year. The American Civil Liberties Union asserts 90% of women in prison today who are violent offenders who killed a male were previously abused by those same men. These victims of domestic violence and sexual assault know better than anyone how shades of gray paint the world and how our criminal justice system must accommodate it. Francine Hughes knows better than anyone how the shades of gray paint our world when after 13 years of abuse, visits from the police, and the final threat of it was all over was brought upon her by her abuser, Mickey Hughes. Francine was arrested after turning herself in immediately following the killing of her abusive partner by burning the house down as he slept. While this trauma was not in vain, as it spawned attention, advocacy, and resources for battered women, these same kinds of victims still suffer in the United States today, a large part of their experience being spurred on by the United States government. The US's refusal to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women is one factor preventing US court systems from adopting ways of understanding domestic violence. By implementing feminist perspectives or other feminist theories. Many skeptics may pursue the idea that in the United States, its people enjoy rights that elude other North American inhabitants, as well as the world's. But looking into prison and reporting statistics, a different perspective is represented. According to the ACLU, women on average suffer greater sentences when compared to their male counterparts, being seen in the form of men receiving 2 to 6 years for spousal murder, and women receiving an average of 15 years for the same crime. Statistics, along with stories like Crystal Potter's, where she served 20 years for shooting her abusive husband of 4 years after he climbed on top of her in his car. And stories like Raven Abora, who only served 7 years after he was convicted of murdering his pregnant wife. Further showing that the discrepancy and mercy the criminal justice system shows male victims has and will continue to not be afforded to the frequently unprotected class of domestic violence survivors. Ratifications of CEDAW ensures a more balanced perspective of domestic violence can be achieved nationwide. According to those survivors, more options in the form of ratifying CEDAW can be I'm so sorry. CEDAW can help implement government resources as well as more considerate sentencings. Regardless of the ratification of CEDAW, the federal government should encourage state governments to enact ordinances reflecting CEDAW benefits, allowing them to make tweaks that fit whatever demographic, enabling nuanced situations to be better handled and defined. While each case that comes in front of our criminal justice system must be scrutinized, especially those of murder, we ask our criminal justice system to give some allowance afforded to drug dealing and self-defense to those suffering from a health problem in the form of brave survivors of domestic violence. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Nick. Renita?
Yes, hi. Hello, everyone. My name is Renita Hoff, and I am representing the human rights class at CSUN. And I am going to dive into the subject of domestic violence and why women, quote unquote, don't leave. When the topic of domestic violence comes up, there's always a question that people ask, as well as judges ask when it comes to sentencing. And that is, why didn't the woman just leave? In order to understand why women don't leave, you first have to understand the social, economic, financial, and legal pressures that women face. First, the social pressure. Whether it is religion or tradition, women, there's a stigma against divorce. Reasons for why victims choose to stay are complex, but boil down to the possibility of their abusers finding and harming them or their loved ones. There's also the issue of financial ruin and the costly custody battles, not to mention the emotional manipulation that is more often than not present in these domestic situations. Other reasons include not being able to safely escape because of the lack of knowledge surrounding shelters and the lack of support, the lack of a support structure to get them there in the first place. Societal barriers to escaping include fear of being charged with deserting their children or losing money in joint accounts, reinforcement from clergy and secular counseling saying they're just trying to save the relationship. Legal barriers also include the lack of support from police officers and law enforcement who may treat violence as a domestic dispute. Victims of abuse are often arrested along with the abuser and charged by law enforcement, even if they were only defending themselves against the batter. When Victims do file charges. Sometimes they are dismissed or law enforcement sides with the abuser, as well as reluctance by prosecutors to prosecute cases, and judges rarely imposing the maximum sentence upon the convicted abusers, which usually they're more likely to be fined or put on probation. Because of isolation of the victim from their friends and family, which is usually the first step abusers do, the victims believe there is no one to turn to. There are all, if not many, of other reasons why victims, quote unquote, choose to stay. So knowing this, your question might be, how can this be minimized or improved legally? There should be an easier access to financial aid from the government, especially if the one requesting help is a victim of violence that simply wants to be able to take care of themselves and possibly their children in a safe environment. That prospect should not be a privilege, but a right. The government has obligations to these people, and as a society, it is unacceptable to let them be left behind. Looking at the totality of this issue, it is clear that the criminalization of self-defense in homes violates a number of clauses in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, such as Article 3 for taking women's rights to safety in her own home, Article 5 for the cruelty of punishing a woman for basic necessity of protecting her life, and Article 7 for the disproportionate sentencing of women in the court for self-defense. And finally, Article 9 for often being targeted by unfair dual arrests in domestic violence situations. These women, for all intents and purposes, are being tortured and have no security of their person. And therefore, it is unacceptable to blame the victim for defending themselves and bringing the level of violence to a degree where they defended themselves, when with better safety nets, as well as better responses and training from law enforcement officers, there wouldn't be nearly as many situations where the abused escalates the violence to this extent. To return to my initial point, the situations should not be able to escalate to this point where a victim is arrested for simply defending themselves to begin with. There should be societal and legal lifelines put in place to prevent that. But in the case that it does not, it is also unacceptable that women be convicted in such a manner. This lack of economic resources and societal stability that keep women trapped within these broken homes are a clear violation of CEDAR's promise of economic and societal equality for women, not to mention their unequal treatment in the criminal justice, in the court of law. Given this fact, it is safe to say that these kinds of laws are a failure and need to be reevaluated in how they assist the plethora of victims of domestic violence abuse. Our call to action is to ask that the many laws set in place to protect victims in cases of self-defense be reevaluated to be more inclusive and influential within the context of domestic violence survivors. We would also like to call upon police agencies to better train their officers in both an in-depth way regarding domestic violence calls, both from a perspective of sensitivity and de-escalation. Finally, we would like to ask the courts to consider stricter discretion for judges that have employed the rulings that we previously talked about. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ronita. And finally, we'll go to Daisy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Daisy Rubio, and I'm representing the Human Rights class at California State University. I will be discussing the topic on discrimination against women in the home and the courts. Before we get started, we want to recognize and give a big thank you to everyone who has been and still is working in this framework. Victims of domestic violence and sexual assault abuse need to be heard. Many times, these victims are overlooked and given a lengthy sentence without having the proper resources available to them. There are short-term and long-term implications for victims. Many victims do not have the appropriate resources to guide them when they need help, or many resources cannot help if they have felonies. I will be discussing some of the facts in a case where a victim was criminalized for defending herself against her abusive partner. Victims of domestic violence or sexual assault have challenges when there are children involved. There have been cases where the children were taken away from the victim and placed with the abuser. Victims of different genders also face challenges while incarcerated, and many are placed in dangerous situations due to their gender. According to the United Nations Human Rights, globally, 1 in 3 women has experienced violence in their lives, most of it taking place within the home or the family. The COVID-19 pandemic increased domestic violence in many countries, which implemented lockdown and confinement measures that also reduced women's ability to report or seek assistance and protection. The Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women recognized that stereotypes and gender prejudice in the judicial system impede access to the justice and may particularly affect women, victims, and survivors of violence. The CSW committee has issued a number of concluding observations in which it directed states parties to abolish the use of the concept of parental alienation in court cases and conduct training on domestic violence, including on the effect that exposure to domestic violence has on children. When it comes to gender, there is a case involving a transgender victim who was criminalized for defending herself against her abuser. She is now facing a 22-year sentence at the Central California Women's Facility. Throughout her young life, Brandy struggled with her gender identity and sexuality. She had no support from her family. She grew up in an emotionally and physically abusive home that provided her with years of harm instead of nurturing that young children need to thrive. She thought she had found support in her partner, who would accept her as a proud Black trans woman. But her partner became abusive, which ultimately led to her incarceration for self-defense. Brandy is one of the 2 transgender women serving time in the women's facility in California. In prison, she has experienced relentless harassment from guards and other prisoners who view her as a freak, and is frequently the brunt of cruel jokes. Robbie Hall was 14 years old and went to prison for 36.5 years. The parole board didn't believe she was a victim. They believed she was acting like the victim. They chose to instead believe in her rapists that were in fact the true victim. Despite the fact that her actions were justified in self-defense, true justice was nowhere to be found. There should be new and more specific laws surrounding ultimate partner violence and focus more on helping domestic violence survivors and victims. Even if they have felonies, there should be more resources available to them. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daisy. So I want to invite the CSUN students to share their videos. There was a technical issue before, so they weren't able to share, and I want you to all be able to see their faces since they spent a lot of time trying to work on this issue. So, so thank you all for your time. Okay, great. All right, so we are going to transition now to hear from Diana Block at the California Coalition of Women Prisoners. A very common approach to human rights advocacy is to develop campaigns at an organizational level that, quote, benefits the community that's served. These advocacy strategies frequently take the form of a deficit model of advocacy, highlighting the devastating experiences of the individuals who are subject to the advocacy without acknowledging their resilience and capacity to thrive under difficult situations. We want to acknowledge the resistance work of those who have been directly impacted by the issues we've been discussing today. Human rights advocacy work should be centered around and led by those who are directly impacted. Too often, solutions proposed to address human rights abuses are structured around preserving existing structures that promote power imbalances. Directly impacted people recognize that the most effective approach to addressing human rights abuses is through dismantling the existing systems and unraveling the root causes of oppression. This is why today we want to center the work of those who've been calling attention to these experiences of incarcerated women, the women prisoners themselves. Prisoner and community-led organizations have been doing the work of abolition, racial and gender equality long before today's event. These organizers have been at the forefront of this work, and we stand beside them and follow their lead, working towards solutions that they think are effective. In California, the organization that's at the forefront of these issues we are highlighting today is the California Coalition of Women Prisoners. CCWP is a grassroots abolitionist organization with members inside and outside prisons that challenge the institutional violence imposed on women, transgender people, and communities of color by the prison industrial complex. They see the struggle for racial and gender justice as central to dismantling the prison industrial complex and prioritize the leadership of people, families, and communities most impacted in building this movement. Diana Block has been an activist for social justice since the 1970s. She's a founding and active member of the California Coalition for Women Prisoners, where she's involved with multiple programs, including reparations for forced sterilization, ending life without parole sentencing, and the Fire Inside newsletter editorial collective. She also serves on the coordinating body of Californians United for a Responsible Budget. Diana?
Hi there. Thank you so much for that introduction and for this entire program and for inviting me to represent CCWP and all our work at this very important forum. I really appreciate all the comments that have come already. Kimberly on trauma, which speaks to the experience of so many people that we at CCWP work with, and all the students who really covered a lot of what I am going to be speaking about. So I apologize if there is some repetition. I will be speaking from the point of view of somebody and an organization that has actually been involved in the work leading up to all the important points that people have already made about incarceration, criminalization, reproductive autonomy, etc. So really, I appreciate so much all of this background, and I learned a lot from it. I also want to appreciate the framing in the context of the United Nations and the struggle for human rights and for women and trans and gender expansive people, because that is a very, very important framework to bring into the conversation, since the United States itself, as it has been pointed out, is so deficient in its acknowledgement regarding gender as well as incarceration, since it is the world's leader, although I don't like to use that term leader since that's has more positive connotations, but the world's leader in incarceration, which I think you all know. So that is a very, very problematic leadership for the United States. But that's why, precisely why, the United Nations offers a very important potential framework for shaming the United States about its practice and what it's about. So I'm going to use some slides. The slides are not necessarily exactly what I'm talking about, but I will use them to try and guide my remarks. Let me first share my screen. I hope it works on the first time. Yeah. Okie dokie, let me see. I'm gonna put it in slideshow mode. That's the wrong one. Okay. So to begin with, I want to just let you know a little bit of background about the California Coalition for Women Prisoners. So we have been in existence since 1995, and we celebrated our 25th anniversary during the pandemic. And we have been doing a variety of work since that time, and much of it is focused on has been focused on both healthcare, reproductive rights, and support for criminalized survivors of sexual violence. So a lot of our work is very closely related to what the topics of today's presentation are. So the California Coalition for Women Prisoners was founded in May 1995 by people inside the prison as well as outside. So that has been one of our foundational principles, that we really work and take guidance from people inside prisons about what their issues are. And on the right, you see one of our founding members, Cherise Shoemate, who unfortunately died of sickle cell disease while she was inside prison after leading a fight against the totally substandard healthcare, which, as speakers have pointed out, is a violation of UN principles to have that type of substandard healthcare in prisons as compared to the larger society. And the rest of that is just kind of our mission statement, which I think Denise already talked about. So a lot of our programs are rooted and grow out of our legal visiting program, as well as our correspondence program, which is called Writing Warriors. And we are accepting people into that program still. It gives people a chance to correspond and advocate for people inside the women's prisons. And that is a program that has just really blossomed over the past few years. We also work around, we work in many regards to decarcerate. As an abolitionist organization, we feel like the most important thing is to get people out of prison. And so many people are there unjustly. I mean, not only the people who are survivors of domestic violence, but also people who have, for many different reasons, been victimized by the criminal legal system. And as many of your speakers pointed out, the overwhelming majority of women, trans people inside prison are Black, brown, and other people of color. And the discrimination in the court system and the way people are charged and sentenced is systemic in our opinion, and therefore working to get people out of prison through many different methods is really a priority for us. So I am going to talk a little bit more about the subject of forced sterilization in the California prisons. As people have mentioned, and I'm so glad people have watched the Belly of the Beast film, which is just a really, really excellent overview of how the fight against forced sterilization emerged, how it was uncovered by a woman, Kelly Dillon, who was in fact sterilized herself, and her lawyer, Cynthia Chandler, who was part of an organization, Justice Now, which is no longer really functioning. So, but did incredible work to really popularize and bring the attention of the state auditors to the issue of forced sterilization. So as people have talked about, people inside the prisons, primarily between 2006 and 2010, there were a few doctors who really had this almost like their mission to ensure that people were sterilized, whom they deemed unfit. And even though the eugenics law had been made illegal in 1979, this was still occurring in California prisons. And so after Kelly Dillon kind of brought her situation to Justice Now, a coalition of our organizations, including CCWP, became involved. And that led to the state audit, which revealed a minimum of 144 people who had been sterilized and a possible maximum of hundreds to thousands, which, you know, unfortunately has not yet been determined or may never be determined because of the ways in which record keeping has been very problematic. And I don't think there's going to be another audit, so it's really unlikely that the numbers are going to become more precise. And I do want to point out that one of the very problematic things is that the audit itself, the records that were brought together and became the basis for the state saying that these people have been sterilized. So all those records were not kept together. We can't say that they were destroyed, but they were disaggregated. And so the material that can point to these are the people who suffered this wrong, that doesn't exist in any one place, which makes the notification of survivors of sterilization very, very difficult. And that's one of the many obstacles that we have been facing in trying to make sure that people who are survivors actually benefit from this groundbreaking, unprecedented reparations program that we were able to win. So that is part of the story, is that there were, it took us about 4 years. Let me ask, I know there is unanticipated construction that's going on in my house right now. So are you able to hear me okay?
You're doing fine, Diana. We can't hear anything in the background.
You can't hear, oh, it's driving me crazy. So
I'm sorry about that. I understand.
Yes, I hear it very loud, but I'm glad that you all can't hear it. We were part of a coalition that worked to win this very groundbreaking legislation that provides compensation, which we like to call reparations, for the harm done to people who were sterilized. Now, this legislation doesn't only cover people who were sterilized inside prison. It also covers people who were sterilized before 1979, because while the law was passed outlawing the eugenics, those people never received any type of recognition or compensation. And so this legislation covers both those groupings of people, although there are really many more people alive who were part of the incarcerated group, because unfortunately, people who were sterilized pre-1979, many of them are have passed, and so are unable to apply for the reparations. So the program is being administered by the Victims' Compensation Board, which is an agency that typically provides compensation to victims of violent crime. And this is somewhat of a contradiction because in general, the Victims' Compensation Board is on the other side of the people who we are representing, the people who are incarcerated. But they are trying to do what they can to a certain extent to make sure that compensation does happen according to the law, which that is, we were able to win this law after 4 years of trying, because at first there was like really very, very little interest. It was very controversial. People didn't like the concept of compensation, especially for people in prison. That has been unheard of. But various factors came together and to influence the legislative process. I think one of the factors, which I'm not sure how many of you have heard of, but there was a whole scandal about sterilizations that were done at the Irwin Detention Center in Georgia the year before, right before we were able to finally win the compensation. And that kind of woke a lot of people up, even though it wasn't California. It woke people up to the enormity of the problem and how people in federal detention centers were being sterilized. And so that kind of was a catalyst for actually approving the legislation in the following year in 2021. I also think the film was part of influencing legislators and really points to the power of filmmaking when it's done in the cause of justice. So a big shout out to Belly of the Beast filmmaking team. So beginning January 2022, people became eligible for the compensation, and people have mentioned the numbers. 4.5 million is the sum total of the money that is available for compensation. And depending upon how many people actually come forward and are awarded the compensation, each person will get more or less money. So people start with a certain amount, and then at the end of the period, depending on how much is left, the remainder, the balance will be distributed among the people who have been found eligible. So eligibility is one of the big questions. So this chart here shows sort of what was discovered by the auditors when they did their study. And so these are numbers that they found, but they weren't able to determine that everyone who was actually subject to a forcible sterilization or a coercive sterilization. And so the number, really the 144 of the bilateral tubal ligations is the number that has been most commonly used to say these are the people that they are sure had were subject to some type of forcible sterilization. But as I said, because they didn't keep the records together, there hasn't been any notification. Those people never knew that they were part of that 144 number. So we have no very straightforward way of getting to them to let them know that it has been determined that this practice happened illegally. So there has been a variety of methods that we have had to use to try and reach out to people to support them in submitting applications. Let me see. Okay, So this just shows you the coalition that came together to work for the legislation. And in addition to CCWP, California Latinas for Reproductive Justice, Back to the Basics, which is an organization that Kelly Dillon started when she got out of prison, and Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, who mainly have worked with what we call the legacy survivors from the pre-1979 period. So we all work together, and we are still working together to try and ensure that people actually get their compensation. So I've kind of talked about the program. These are the numbers as of the end of January. There have been 61 people altogether approved from all groups. And among the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation people that are the incarcerated people, only 58. So, and the pre-1979 people, only 3. So you can see that is very, very small numbers compared to the ways, the extent of the problem. And so one of the things we are really stressing at this point is outreach. The Victims' Compensation Board did get $1 million for administration and outreach. Unfortunately, they didn't hire the outreach firm to start until the beginning of this year, January 2023, a year after the whole program had begun. So that means that we kind of lost a year in getting the word out very broadly to the public. We feel like we have done a good job in getting the word out to the incarcerated people because it's a smaller number. We can reach, we have a lot of contacts inside. We have communication all the time through our newsletter, The Fire Inside, and other programs. So we have gotten the word out to people inside prison. But formerly incarcerated people are dispersed all over the state, all over the country. And that's where we really need the help of outreach marketing firms to really figure out how to get the word out. And insofar as any of you are connected to community organizations, healthcare facilities, etc., we really hope that you will spread the word about this program and make sure that people at least are knowledgeable that it exists through family members, through other people, community members who might hear about it or see the notice on the bulletin board and realize that they know someone who might have been affected. So aside from the outreach, the other problem is how large the number of denials of applications has been. And that is a big problem because it depends on how the people who are in the Victims' Compensation Board are actually interpreting medical records. And medical records are the record from the doctor's point of view. So it is very hard for people to prove that they really were not informed that that this could keep them from having children, or that they really could have had another procedure if they were having heavy bleeding, that this was not the best procedure, that it was the most extreme procedure. So those are the kind of things that we are trying to discover through our own examination of medical records. And we do have a team of OBGYN people who are willing to review records. So we have, we are trying to do our best to actually support the people who should be benefiting from this program. But we need everybody's help. anyone who is interested or can spread the word is really welcome to be part of this effort, which is, as I said, unprecedented in the sense that people in prison have never received reparations for anything, even though the harms that have been done to them are multiple. This is one of the survivors of forced sterilization. Her name is Moonlight Pulido. She is a Native woman. She did receive compensation, which we're very, very pleased about. And she has also been talking about her experience and the ways in which one of the doctors, the most infamous doctor, Dr. Heinrich, actually treated her and told her to her face that she should not be having children because they would just end up on welfare, essentially. So she is one of the people who we are really, really honored to be working with in this period as a spokesperson for all of the survivors who cannot really speak out for themselves. I have some other quotes. I'm not going to read them now. These are from other people who are survivors, but we will send out these slides afterwards so that you have a chance to look at them more closely yourself. If you want more information, these just more testimony. And this is a list of resources that we will also be sharing. And there are many more resources, but these are some that we put together for a speak out event that I think some of you, some of the students may have attended. And we sent the resources afterwards to make sure that people know how expansive the information and materials are about and are growing all the time, as they should, because this is such a really terrible and very it exemplifies the types of abusive care, abusive treatment that people in women's prisons experience all the time. And so we really are really trying to get the word out, because it shines a light not only on the sterilizations themselves, but all the human rights violations that people experience. So I know I'm speaking very quickly, but I do want to get through these slides and leave some time for questions for all of our speakers here today. But I did want to highlight a few other points that relate more to the issue of criminalization of survivors, which several of you have already spoken to. This woman is Maricela Andrade. She got a life without parole sentence for killing her trafficker. And she is from Mexico. She was brought into this country without documentation and lived through incredible violence and sexual abuse. And then after she resisted, finally, she got this life without parole sentence, which, because of her story and because of her record, her good record in prison, her sentence was commuted by then Governor Brown in 2018. And she then was able to get paroled from prison. As soon as she was paroled, she was then handed over to ICE because she doesn't have documentation. And even though really she should be eligible for a U visa or one of the other many mitigating types of programs that have been developed for survivors of violence. But unfortunately, so far, she hasn't been able to get a judge to approve any of those, which is just part of the stigmatization of someone who has been in prison, regardless of the reasons. So now what we're trying to do, our campaign is focused on getting a pardon from Governor Newsom, a pardon for the crime for which she was convicted and then later released. But because if she gets a pardon, that means she is no longer considered someone with a quote criminal history who has to be deported. And that is, a very unfortunate part of the law, which impacts so many other immigrants in the prison systems. So that is one part of a campaign that we're working on to get Maricela a pardon. In our work with criminalized survivors, we work very closely. We are one of the founding members of the organization, the network Survived and Punished, which is really focused on the criminalization of survival and ending it. And they are an amazing organization that really shines a light on this specific aspect of criminalization. In our opinion, there are many ways in which people are criminalized unjustly, and on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, on the basis of class. And then the last piece that I do want to just mention, because there's a criminalization of survivors who experience violence on the outside from an individual. But then there are countless examples of the ways in which those same survivors are violated sexually, physically, emotionally in prison by prison staff. And one of the most egregious has occurred in the past few years at the federal prison in Dublin. Now, we are perhaps mainly focused on the state prisons at this point, but federal prisons are prisons. They just have a report to a different jurisdiction. And in Dublin, California, which is just 30 miles outside of San Francisco, over the past number of years, there have been numerous staff and who have been found to have engaged in terrible sexual abuse inside that prison. And the warden has already been convicted. The chaplain, many other guards and other staff have all been charged with abuse. And this came about after years of women trying to report on that abuse, but unfortunately they weren't listened to, and in many cases they were retaliated against. But then finally some brave woman was able to get through all the hurdles and bring her story to an investigative unit, and that opened up the whole story. And there has been a lot of publicity now, which you may have read some of it, which yes, it's very hard to read a lot of the accounts, but I do think it's very important for people interested or concerned about what is going on in that it has to do with gender oppression in this country. This is a really an example that exposes the problems with prisons in general. And so we formed the Dublin Prison Solidarity Coalition. CCWP was one of its founding members. And our focus is not on the prosecution of the individuals, but on systemic changes that could try and deal with some of the ways in which these abuses occur. And so that we are really trying to publicize this issue, because it is an issue that impacts women's prisons all around the country. I mean, I could run down the list. Michigan, New Jersey, Florida. These are all places that have had terrible staff sexual abuse of people in women's prisons over the past 5 years. So that is a really important campaign that we are trying to publicize. And I will encourage everyone to come to our town hall, which is on March 30th, called Time's Up Dublin, and to hear from survivors and learn about the litigation that we are planning, and talk to congressional offices about what they can do to help create the change that we need. So I know that the time is really close to being up. Just if anyone wants to be in touch about any of the things that I have talked about, info@womenprisoners.org is the email that you should contact. So thank you, and lots of information. Sorry if I talked so fast, but glad to be here to get this information to you all.
Thanks so much, Diana. It's so critical that we had, you on, because really the work of those women who, have been incarcerated and prisoners are at the center of this, and we should really honor their leadership. And I think that's an important contribution. So thank you so much for your contributions. And I'm really glad that you brought in the issues in Dublin, California. Women Lead Network, I know we've talked before, did a lot of work around this particular issue at the Universal Periodic Review of the United States, specific to immigration detention and the abuse, including sexual violence, that was occurring within the centers. So thanks so much for bringing that here. We do know that we are wrapping up, and we wanted to give folks an opportunity to maybe ask some questions of the presenters. If there are questions, if you would raise your hand, it would be help us so that we could make sure that everybody gets a chance if they'd like one. Does anybody have any questions for any of the presenters that have shared? Okay, I'm not sure I'm seeing any. Okay, Katie is asking, has the UN Special Rapporteur on Prisons visited these prisons? Diana, do you have a response to that?
In the past, not for many years, there was, when the report on solitary confinement came out, or the resolution, I believe that a rapporteur did visit the women's prisons. And before that, years before that, there had been someone, I think, who came in relationship to torture, and I think solitary has been one of the main focuses. To my knowledge, there's never been anyone who has investigated the level of sexual abuse that goes on inside the prisons. And definitely there hasn't been anyone regarding the sterilizations and violations of reproductive rights, which really do go beyond the sterilization. I just want to make that clear. There are multiple ways in which women have their reproductive rights violated inside prison, but the sterilization is sort of the most I won't even say egregious, but it highlights the problem for the other types of violations.
Yeah, thank you, Katie, for this question. I think I know that one of the reasons that it was so important for us to bring these issues to this forum is because the experiences of incarcerated women have been largely invisible in this sort of environment. I mean, In 2011, the Special Rapporteur addressing violence against women came to the US and noted that there were high levels of sexual violence against women in prisons, but there hasn't been a lot of focus on women in detention. And so this is one of the reasons that, we wanted to share this here, and have made a commitment to continue to raise these issues in a variety of forums, because, I think one of the significant sort of outcomes of this is recognizing that we want to ensure that when we're talking about equity and equality for women, that we're inclusive of all women, right? That we're not forgetting about particular groups of women, especially noting, as Diana sort of alluded to a little bit when she was talking about victims' compensation, that oftentimes within women's advocacy groups, there's sort of this division between those who, work around victimization of women and those who work in relationship to incarceration. And the reality is that we can't really look at those as separate things, right? We have to sort of look at them together. So thanks so much for that question, Katie. Any other sort of questions or, whether in chat or via raised hands that you'd like to share before we close out today? Okay, so let me just sort of wrap everything up. There was a question about information related to today, including the slides. We'll post that information on the event page at the forum. So our event page in the forum, whatever platform. So we'll post those there. We really want to thank you for joining us today. We think that this is an issue that has been largely invisible. So often stories of those who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated and their lives become really invisible, especially in a society that has the largest carceral system in the world. And this, of course, is on the backdrop, as we talked about before, of the eroding rights of women to bodily autonomy in the US. And so we think it's really critical that we work really actively towards dismantling the systems of oppression that perpetrate, right, these types of abuses, and at the same time make them invisible. So, as we close, I just wanted to call your attention to some of the ways that you all might be able to take action. Certainly, the students worked really hard to develop some recommendations, including, for example, the forced sterilization group, who recommend that as a society that we recognize that incarcerated women are entitled to the same level of health care as women who aren't incarcerated, that we prioritize informed consent, that we ensure that these women have access to their medical records, and that we simplify the application process to maybe provide them with some means of reparations. Although, as Diana and the students pointed out, it's a very limited means. And then the, criminalization of survivorship group made some recommendations around really the application of a gendered lens in all criminal justice adjudications, to follow the Bangkok rules and avoid incarceration for all women, specifically those who are experiencing gender-based violence or have experienced gender-based violence, to commute the sentences of incarcerated survivors. And, we heard of the work that CCWP is doing related to the dropping of life without parole sentences. So these are all recommendations that were made. CCWP has a variety of campaigns that Diana pointed out. I dropped a link to their website in the chat box, and those include contacting victims of forced sterilization in whatever way we can, really being fully engaged in the outreach so that even though we have this very limited amount of time, we can do, the best that we can to provide access. And then, Diana highlighted the organization Survived and Punished, which is a community-led program that advocates for the decriminalization of self-defense to gender-based violence. And they have a variety of commutation campaigns, some of them in California and others around the country and other states. So we encourage you to go to their website and check out their materials. All right, well, again, thank you. And what we ask as we end here is that you just really not turn away from this, that you be willing to look at these issues in the face and to engage fully in the dismantling of the systems that have created them. I want to thank all of the speakers, Diana, Kimberly, the students and their contributions, and definitely Abby, who was monitoring us in the background. So thanks so much, everybody, for attending, and we will, again, include some more materials on the event page. Thank you, everybody.